multiple woes. Uh, by the way, has anybody figured out this mystery hat yet? Just wondering. Uh, and one further point, it turns out that when we get to session number 58, 6 more after this session, we will in fact be finished with Habakkuk. And at that time, if things work out the way we'd like, we'll move on to Hosea. Well, in these next 15 verses, we're not going to look at all of them today, of course. We're going to look at 6 of them. In the next 15 verses, God gives a series of 5 woes as a judicial indictment of the Chaldeans or Babylonians, each leading to a future judgment. Now, each of the woes, and there are 5 of these woes, is directed at a specific type of evil. And let me just list them for you. Number 1, it will be a woe for plunder, pride, and ambition in verses 6 through 8. Then number 2, there'll be a woe for greed and enrichment by unjust gain, verses 9 to 11. 3, a woe for iniquity, building an empire by spilling blood in verses 12 to 14. Number 4, a woe for indignity, degrading neighboring countries for gain. That'll be in verses 15 through 17. And finally, a woe for idolatry in verses 18 through 20. Interestingly, though, the 5 are couched as taunts of the Babylonians by their victims. In other words, apparently, God is telling Habakkuk that the victim nations will rise up and make fun of, taunt the Chaldeans. Now, woe indicates a future distress brought about through disaster or judgment. In this case, of course, it will be judgment. You might look, for example, at Ezekiel 24, woes God pronounced against Judah about the same time that Habakkuk was recording these woes against Babylon. So Jeremiah was predicting and prophesying woes against Judah, their judgment, and here it's against Babylon or Chaldeans in the case of Habakkuk. In Isaiah 5, 8 through 30, there's an earlier set of 6 woes aimed at Judah in judgment that was executed by the Babylonians. Now, each of Habakkuk's 5 woes consists of 3 verses, very fixed. Jesus often used woes to describe judgment, where as far as we know, let me ask this as a form of a question. As far as we know, where did he first offer a set of several woes as a contrast to blessings? Well, the blessings part probably gave it away. It'd be the Sermon on the Mount. Luke's version in Luke 6, verses 17 through 26, Luke gives a series of woes, and each woe has a counterpart in the list of blessings that found in Luke. Let me read, say, just verses 24, 5, and 6 from Luke 6. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Notice, blessed are the poor. Woe to those who are rich. Verse 25, woe to you who are full now, for you shall be hungry. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after God, so forth. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Blessed are those who mourn and weep. Woe to you when all people speak well of you, for their fathers did to the false prophets, for so the fathers did to the false prophets. Well, the rest of God's second response to Habakkuk, these 5 woes, were filled with Old Testament descriptions of what is called in the Latin lex talionis, L-E-X, second world T-A-L-I-O-N-E-S, known as the law of retaliation or the law of retribution. The first woe pictures the Babylonians as an unscrupulous, wealthy individual who uses power to exploit the weak, even to the point of virtual slavery. Habakkuk 2, we read verses 6 through 8. Shall not all of these, that is, the victims of the Chaldeans, take up their taunt, that's the thing we spoke of a minute ago, against him, the Chaldeans, with scoffing and riddles for him to say, woe to him who heaps up what is not his own, or how long, and loads himself with pledges. Will not your debtors, the victims, suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them, the victims. Verse 8, because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the people shall plunder you, for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities, and all who dwell in them. In other words, there's going to come a payback time. The taunt is a kind of proverb, and it suddenly comes out of nowhere. The central figure is to be the object of ridicule and scorn. Scorned by whom? Whom? Who are these? Well, verse 8 tells us. They are those who survived the evil of the perpetrator, the Chaldeans. I have trouble with that, don't I? Thus, retribution, payback. Heaps up what is not his own means to be taken by extortion. It's a clear indication that the subject, the Chaldeans, have taken plunder by force, theft, or some other non-ethical manner. It's a form of international criminality. Interestingly, the Hebrew for extortion can be rendered a cloud of dust. I don't know whether that means by throw up a cloud of dust, you can't tell what the guy's doing. It's a scam artist or what, for sure. Pledges were items or other values taken as security by a creditor. Excuse me. We see that in Isaiah 5:8. Woe to those, and these are Israelite real estate owners that Isaiah was talking about hundreds of years earlier. Woe to those Israelite real estate owners who join house to house, who add field to field until there is no more room, and you are made to dwell alone in the midst of the land. The wealthy and greedy landowners were amassing large estates at the expense of the average man. Now, the land was given by clans during Joshua's day when they came into the promised land, and the land was to remain with the original tribes. In the case of the sale of the land, which the poor could do, but there then became the year of Jubilee, which was to mark the return of that land back to the original owner. Or, if they didn't want to wait till the year of Jubilee, a kinsman redeemer could be allowed to buy the property back and return it to the rightful owner. So these real estate moguls were violating those principles that God set up during the taking of the land of promise. In Habakkuk's case, pledges likely represent heavy taxation that the Chaldeans would level against survivors of their campaigns. Debtors, as earlier, are the surviving individuals and nations. So Babylon enriched itself through plunder, that's verse 6. And the woe asked, how long? Notice that was the same complaint that Habakkuk raised. How long? A lament form. He was saying, how long is this going to continue? And so those raising the taunt were also asking this question. The woe includes two questions with answers commencing in the latter part of verse 7. The Babylonian shakedown will come to an end suddenly. One day, the weak, the nations and peoples who are vanquished by the Babylonian violence and despoiled of their wealth and freedom, will rise up and turn on their tormentors in lex talionis. They would be payback in verse 8 for all the death and destruction brought on by the Babylonian military. The repayment will be for the untold devastation to people, cities, and even the land itself. Babylon will shudder, and in victim retaliation will be itself plundered. Now, lex talionis would one day come upon the Babylonians in the same manner as the Babylonians had given to their victims. And we can say, what goes around comes around. The retribution fits the law of sowing and reaping, which you've heard me quote from Dr. Charles Stanley before. You get what you sow. Later than you sow, more than you sow. You sow plunder and violence. Somewhere along the way, you are going to reap sunder and violence back, but more than you gave out. That's why Babylon will tremble or shudder. Isaiah said something similar about Assyria, who, remember, was God's tool for disciplining the northern kingdom many years earlier. As a matter of fact, over 100 years earlier. Isaiah 33:1. Ah, you destroyer, that's the Assyrians, who yourself have not been destroyed, you traitor, whom none has betrayed. When you have ceased to destroy, you will be destroyed, and when you have finished betraying, they will betray you. That was accomplished by the Babylonians during the thing that we're talking about with Habakkuk. The Assyrians' war effort, like those of the Chaldeans, were not moral responses to some wrong they had incurred. They weren't retaliating for having been destroyed or betrayed. They were simply out for plunder and violence. Well, let's go back to Habakkuk. God had a plan all along. He had not ignored the plight of the Judeans as Habakkuk originally thought. Which nation in particular, having been a victim of Babylonian conquest, was the one nation who put a sudden end to their reign? Well, you can find that in Daniel 5. It was the Medes and the Persians. Well, let me summarize woe number 1. The Babylonians gathered unjust gain by military conquest. The victims, however, would rise up against them in the end. The one who was the plunderer will become the plundered in lex talionis. In Habakkuk's second woe, God echoes the previous woe while centering on the evil of greed and outlining the motives behind Babylonian behaviors. So let's look at the second woe. Woe to him, the Chaldeans, who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. You Chaldeans have devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You have forfeited your life, for the stone will cry out from the wall and the beam from the woodwork respond. The greedy, unjust, and self-aggrandizing, that is, on the evil gain that the Babylonians sought plunder, as in the first woe, and their power, all for personal enrichment. Their nest on high is symbolic that they were attempting to build an impregnable fortress. And generally it would be a mountain fortress, but it simply implies here, I believe, that they're trying to become so powerful, so rich that nobody can touch them. They want to protect themselves from calamity, evil, and harm. They want to make their cities and their nation, that word's his house, refers to the nation. They want to make it immune from attack. Well, this was not the only time the Old Testament makes reference to such conceit. The idea that you can build something so high and impregnable that nobody can get to you. God spoke of a self-assured Edom in this case. Excuse me, in case you're wondering, part of that cough may be from COVID-19, which I have picked up. Obadiah 3 and 4 read this way. The pride of your heart, that's Edom's heart, has deceived you. You live in the clefts of the rock. They did have cities high in the mountains in rocky, clefty areas. In your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars, from there I, Yahweh, will bring you down, declares the Lord. Edom, by the way, did occupy a mountainous region, as I said, with major cities high and well protected. But like Babylon, Edom considered only human opponents and did not consider Yahweh. And God did bring them down just as he said. As a matter of fact, Edom exists no more. The verse 10, we read that the Babylonian methods were cruel at best, but God determined their cruelty would double back to their shame. The leaders of Babylon's leaders had counseled the military to kill unnecessarily, at least it seems that way. God in verse 11 said, these very buildings, the plunder, or the material from plunder, would attest to Babylonian criminality. Perhaps because the buildings were, as I said, constructed of materials taken by force or some other form of exploitation. We have a similar phrase today, in possession of stolen property. And if you are found in possession of stolen property, it is evidence to be used against you. So let's take a quick review of the second woe. The Babylonians were motivated solely by self-aggrandizement. They trampled and killed others to build a secure nation. But Babylon will be covered with shame and lose its natural life in lex talionis. And who will be the perpetrator? The Lord God Almighty. Well, we have a couple of takeaways from this short introduction to these 5 woes. We've looked at 2 of them. We'll look at 3 next. Extortion by any means, threat, force, or deceit comes under the law of sowing and reaping. You will reap what you sow, later than you sow, and more than you sow. Inappropriately gathered gain of any sort will bring eventual shame rather than glory. And as I said, in the next session, we will take up the final 3 woes. Remember, we've only got 6 more times in Habakkuk. Then we'll move on, hopefully, to Hosea. We'll see you next time.